Hello, I'm Susie. This is my podcast. Welcome. Hey, do you want to have a quickie? I thought I'd just whip something up here because I have thoughts. I have thoughts about stuff that's happening in the world. I'm sure you do too. I mean, everybody does, right? But do you have a podcast? I do. You probably should go get one. Go make one. It's easy. If I can do it, literally anyone can do it. But I digress. I want to talk today about woke. It's a thing. It's going around like chicken pox. I don't know. It's a ambiguous thing that's happening in mainstream culture right now, and it's a distortion from its origins, as most things in mainstream culture are. And I want to talk a little bit about it because we're hearing a lot about it, and in like a not great way, and that's by design. And it's well, frankly, it's pissing me off. It's bothering me. It's bothering a lot of people. It's bothering a lot of liberals in particular. I have previously already confessed my liberal leanings. I mean, that's obvious. If you've listened to literally any single one of my podcasts, you know my liberal leanings. Be that as it may, I do want to just kind of break down some thoughts and really just get some stuff off my chest, if I'm honest. So thanks for listening in advance. If you stick around, I promise to be at least a little entertaining. It's not well researched. It's off the cuff. It's just stuff going on in my brain, and that's what's in store. If you pay attention to any kind of news in or kind of media generally speaking, you'll have noticed a big surge in the use of the word woke. It's getting thrown around a terrible lot, and it's sort of this avatar for I don't know, leftist, liberal, socialist indoctrination theory, I suppose, is how it's being kind of advertised. At least that's how it feels to me, like that. But it's a curious dynamic because, I think most of us would agree there are two, media streams, if you will, right? There's the right wing conservative media sphere, which has its own sort of island and its own rules. I've discussed that, previously. And then there's sort of the quote mainstream media, which would incorporate kind of, everything else, right? Like print journalism, the news agencies like Reuters and AP, and then the journalistic, reporting sources within, cable news sphere, right? Your CNNs and your CNBCs and your MSNBCs and, et cetera. So, again, that division exists, and it has created a weird conversation in our culture, and arguably it also has created an environment in which conversation becomes nearly impossible because we've got these intractable dichotomy positions, right? These like hard and set oppositions that are a little bit insurmountable, like under the current circumstances, right? But the mainstream media basically takes what is going on, like the conversations and the propaganda going on in the conservative news sphere, like the conservative media sphere, and then the conservative media sphere typically takes something from the liberal activist space and then, kind of props it up, misrepresents it, says a bunch of lies about it. And then the media, the mainstream media, picks up on that principle and then doubles down on their own propaganda, which is like kind of a two-faced conversation, which is one, like kind of, presented as a fact check, which is, all well and good and great, like much needed. Thank you. But also as a condemnation. which, also it's kind of hard to argue against from my perspective, because if you are like a legitimate journalist, like if you're in news and you really feel like the principle of reporting the news is something that's like, meant to be this noble endeavor to like help bring information to the people so that they know, what their government is doing, since ostensibly we're a democracy and so we're self-governed. So if you're a person who's in that role and you see this very influential like media mechanism that distorts that principle and just kind of spews out a bunch of like, colored information, like filtered information through a specific lens as fact, it's upsetting. It's upsetting. It is damaging. First of all, it has real impacting damage, which I'm going to talk about momentarily. But it also is just like, it's offensive, to your ideals as a journalist. Like, fuck you. I'm doing actual work over here, and sort of take the credibility out of the entire, endeavor by bringing your propagandistic efforts and presenting them as journalism. Like I get it. Honestly, I don't know how anybody doesn't get it. But I often have that problem. I often can't understand how people don't see what I think is obvious, which I think is also a common problem. I think most of us have that assumption, right? Like it's obvious. Everybody gets this. Everybody has a totally different point of view on that, which is frustrating. But once again, I digress. So specifically, this thing I want to talk about is woke. What is it? Why do we keep talking about it? And why is everybody like, oh, like we're so over it? Okay, let's break it down. Woke, as with most of the best stuff in American pop culture, the idea of woke came from Black popular culture, pre-Twitter, man. Like it wasn't just a Black Twitter thing. It's the phrase is stay woke, right? Like keep your eyes open in a system that's built on and propped up on white supremacy. As a person of color, like you got to maintain constant vigilance. That is the principle behind woke, right? Eyes open. And so that extends to the idea of, as a citizen in a democracy, right? Like stay aware of what is happening within governance and public policy that then has direct impact on its citizens, right? And then further extends to a more like cultural understanding of how the policy and legislative landscape evolved, right? Then there is a cultural absorption of that, right? That then gives a section of a marginalized community a voice that they never have had before. And so the cultural idea of wokeism is to understand the boundaries of the conversation historically, and who had a voice before and or didn't, more specifically, and who has the voice now, and how do they use that voice, and what does it mean, right? And I don't think any of us would assume that just because a person is suddenly empowered, with a voice, that that voice is always like true and meaningful and like pure and like awesome wisdom. No, not necessarily. It is sometimes idiotic, but that doesn't make it any less valid in its, autonomy and its agency, which is really the point. You know, being woke is about being aware of what is freaking happening around you. It's as simple as that. Don't close your eyes to obvious truths. But let's go back, because as I just said, what's obvious to some of us somehow isn't obvious to everyone. So we got to have a conversation about it, right? So let's go back to the origin of staying woke. Have you ever heard of the Green Book? If you have not heard of the Green Book, you should probably check it out. The Green Book has been, or historically was in the United States, a tourist guide for African American people who had to travel throughout the United States. It was like, an ABC guide, right, for Black people in America to find safe harbor, to find places where they could get food, places where they could rest, places where they could go to the bathroom, right? Places where they could experience basic human dignity without having to be like under the threat of constant violence. This was during a period where towns throughout the South had what were called sundown rules, which were if you were a Black person in the limits of their jurisdiction after sundown, you were fair game to be murdered. Murdered, just executed as an American citizen. That was a real thing that happened, and at the time, the people in those states felt perfectly entitled to do those things. And so things like the Green Book were developed to help African Americans within their own communities find safe places to exist. You know, the co-opting of cultural language like woke, it's very often things that we derive from Black Twitter particularly, right? That's where a lot of the gold comes from, right? Black Twitter, perhaps not so much these days. I don't really know. I'm not a huge Twitter user, full disclosure. But yes, I tried to deactivate my Twitter account and it's like almost impossible. Like it's really weird. I somehow am never successful at fully doing it, but I don't know. I've also become like old and not agile with technology anymore. It's a steeper curve these days. One of the points, though, is that co-opting cultural language originating in Black culture is happening for a reason. Let's talk about Florida. It's a really elegant use case for emerging autocracy within a democratic society. It's a fascist enclave really now within, or it's an attempt at a fascist enclave is what it looks like. The targeting of subjects in schools that surround Black history is happening for a reason. Attacking education, it's happening for a reason. The need for an informed electorate in a democratic system is absolutely essential. It is key to the entire endeavor. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, right? That's the principle. And you can't actively participate in self-governance if you have no freaking idea how the government works or what it's doing or, what its policies are. And as we've become larger as a nation and more significant in the global community, then those contours change a little bit, but the principles more or less remain the same, which is it's, the struggle for power and the dynamics that, established power will always resist its own downfall, right? I mean, of course, that's what power does. But ultimately, there is a threat to democracy that lies in the erosion of the people's understanding of their own power. That's the point, right? Keep them dumb. Keep them dumb and scared and just tell them that you have the answers. And if they just fall in line, then you're going to fix it. That's what Ron DeSantis is doing right now. And it's a very, old playbook. It's a really old and tired, frankly, formula for suppressing marginalized communities. I mean, it's all the same, stuff. Education and access to education has been a hard-fought battle for African Americans throughout American history, and there's no way to go backwards without specific and direct harm to all Americans. The victories earned by civil rights activists and American citizens of color accrue benefits to all citizens. Equality is its own reward, basically, but if that's not something that you believe, that equality is something that exists, uniformly for across all citizens, then of course you're going to find ways to try to suppress their voice and their power, right? But again, there's no going backwards. It's too late. It's too late for this. So from my perspective, where we are is we're just all going to have to suffer through it, right? We're all just going to have to endure while people try to get comfortable with the idea that human beings are equal. It doesn't matter any other conditions that might exist, whether their skin tone is different, whether, they have a vagina. There are no distinctions between humanity. I want to balance out the equation a little bit because everything up to this point has been kind of bleak. I admit a degree of frustration and a certain degree of anger at the injustice that I feel I see before me and the kabuki quality of it all. It's all so performative and it's such a disappointment. But there's light. There will be a congressional hearing within the next week discussing the ratification, the final acceptance of the Equal Rights Amendment. I've talked about the ERA in a previous pod, in a conversation that I was having. It's a conversation with myself. Look, I'll stand by it. I mean, it's a monologue, but I'm having a conversation with myself. You're just, I guess, along for the ride. Though I like to imagine you sitting across from me and exchanging thoughts, but that doesn't work on this kind of format. That's a pathway I got to follow in a different way. But once again, I digress. I told you, it's a quickie. I'm winging it. I'm winging it up here. I got no script. I got no research. I'm just talking to you because I love you. And I know that you love me back. So thanks. Anyway, the ERA, was introduced 100 years ago. 100 years. It was introduced in 1923 in connection with the suffrage movement. And it was, friggin' bounced hard. And then, they try to, poke it back in, and ain't nobody got time for that, right? Communism, up until 1972 when it passed in both chambers of Congress. Yay! And then had to be ratified. It was very quickly ratified by 35 states, the requirement being that 3/4 of the states had to ratify in order for it to become an amendment to the Constitution. So at that point, we had 35, we needed 38. And interestingly enough, there was a timeline attached to this amendment. As with, not specifically the ERA, there was a period of time when, for whatever reason, Congress was adding timelines for ratification, so that if it didn't occur, if it wasn't ratified within a certain amount of time, then it would sunset and go away, which is why the ERA has never been amended to the Constitution. And so the hearing that's coming up is essentially to ask Congress to sort of say that deadline, right? That timeline is it's arbitrary. It's not relevant. Like, we can go ahead and just, we have the 38th state that ratified in 2020. It was Virginia. I'm so disappointed in you, Virginia. It took you until 2020 to decide that women are equal people. Really? Man, that's a mess. That's a mess. Okay. But, P.S. the 12 of you, the 12 states that didn't bother to ratify at all, fuck you, honestly. But, I still love you, but fuck you. So 100 years. It's been 100 years since the amendment was first introduced. It may become actual constitutional principle, very soon. It maybe even in this year, although I don't know. I guess I'll believe it when I see it. But this relates in a specific way to what I was talking about earlier relative to sort of cultural awareness, because cultural awareness basically feels like women are equal, which is great. Like, everybody feels it ideologically. And yet, systemically, our systems don't treat women as equal. The most obvious example being pay, right? Like, on average, women make 83 cents to the dollar for every dollar the man earns, right? So that's a gap, right? Why? It's arbitrary. It doesn't make any sense. It's stupid. Equal humans doing equal work should be getting equal pay. Like, that's obvious. So right? The gap matters. If there's no word in the Constitution that, signifies the fact that women are equal humans, then apparently it is license for people to behave as though they are not. So let's just get rid of that problem, right? And it looks like we're about to. And I'm really proud of us for finally getting there. I think it'll make a difference. People will say that, whatever, It's not that big a deal. Like, what's all the fuss? That's a huge freaking fuss, man. Like, and again, this is another one of those things to me that feels so obvious. Like, like women are people. There's nothing different about them in any discernible way. There's no demonstrable evidence that women are cognitively different, physically different in any conceivable way outside of their reproductive systems. So shut the fuck up. Like about women not, being equal while not being treated equally. Let's just fix that. Let's fix that imbalance. And then we can all stop whinging about it and move on. Focus on some other problems. And that'll be great. And I know you can hear my frustration because, once again, it's frustrating to feel like something is very clear and have people be like, whatever, right? Like there's the Cassandra syndrome thing where Cassandra was a woman who could see the future, but she was cursed that people wouldn't believe her. So she'd like warn everybody that like bad shit was about to go down, and people would be like, ugh, Cassandra, like drama. And she'd be like, no, for real, like it's coming. And then bad shit would go down, and and she'd be sort of forced to watch the chaos when she knew it could be avoided. It's painful. I mean, if you're a person of empathy of any kind, it's painful to watch people suffer unnecessarily. It sucks. So I encourage everybody to keep that in mind when you're thinking about why are women, still complaining about lack of equal treatment. Well, because the government, the documents that govern our society, right, are the principles that govern our society. Don't even mention women as an entity. That's a problem. Like, that's an obvious problem. That's what I think. Okay, so that's what I have. That's what's on my mind, and I needed to get it off my chest. I want to say that I encourage you to don't get like beat down by all of the noise that surrounds like the, quote, battle on wokeism, like the war on woke, like whatever all that bullshit is. It's just advertising for a specific political ideology. And that political ideology does not represent democratic values. It is authoritarian in its most extreme form. And that is what I would think is commonly referred to as a slippery slope, right? Like that's a very close connection to now, continuing to erode the rights of a segment of American citizenship based on arbitrary values, which is not democratic. So the war on woke, sorry, y'all, it's the war on democracy. Stay woke.